Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog, The Voice for Liberty, at wichitaliberty.org. There, the motto is individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and economic freedom in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, please visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. Well, this week, it isn't very long before the Kansas Legislature starts its 2016 session. Monday, January 11th is the first day. I'd like to take a look at a few issues the legislature will have to deal with and some issues that it should. But first, there is one thing that receives a lot of attention, but I think really has little real importance, and that is the length of the legislative session. Kansas law prescribes a session of 90 days, and last year the session lasted 113 days, or 114 if we count the largely ceremonial final day. Everyone talked about the record-breaking long session, and recently Senate President Susan Wagle told the Wichita Pachyderm Club that she would like to see this year's session, the upcoming session, be over in 75 days. But I think the length of the session is one of the least important things we should worry about. Now it costs, I think, about $50,000 per day to run the legislature, and we should not spend that money needlessly. But I think it is more important to do things right and to do the right things than it is to have a short legislative session. Year after year, legislators tell us that there was not time to do things that some people consider to be very important. Wait until next year, they say. But if legislative leaders say that we can have a 75-day session, well, I think it's more important to have a 90-day session and accomplish some things that have been put off. But even before this, it is important that the legislature do a few things that are nonpartisan in nature and will cost very little. One is letting Kansans know more about the proceedings of the legislature. Currently, audio of the sessions of the Kansas Senate and House of Representatives are broadcast on the Internet. And that's good. But the broadcasts are live only. There is no archive of recordings. You must listen live, in real time, or figure out some way to record the audio over your computer, which isn't really very easy to do. Now, there is desire by some for live video of the legislature, which, would be great. And even better would be archived video, where a person does not have to watch live. But these options are expensive. The expenditure would be worthwhile, to be sure, but there doesn't seem to be much desire to spend on this. Audio, however, provides almost all the benefits of video in this case, and it's really cheap. For $8 per month, the legislature could make audio recordings of its proceedings available to listen to at any time. Yeah, that's right. For $8 per month, at least one podcast hosting company offers an unlimited plan, unlimited storage, unlimited bandwidth. That's just what is needed. Now, for $79 per month, the same company offers a plan geared towards business with additional features like multiple administrative users. That's probably more appropriate for the legislature, but the $8 plan would work too. And since the audio of the proceedings is already broadcast on the Internet, it must pass through a computer somewhere. And that computer could also be recording the audio. And once recorded, the process of uploading the audio to the podcast host is a trivial procedure. There needs to be no editing. In fact, any editing other than cutting away silence before the start and after the end of the session must be disallowed. But there's a problem here. Neither Kansas Legislative Chamber records their proceedings, according to responses from the Secretary of the Senate and the Chief Clerk of the House when I asked for a recording. Making audio archives or podcasts of legislative sessions would be so simple. It is almost without cost. It would have great benefit. Interns could do the work, and it would be good experience for them. But the Kansas Legislature does not do this, and it doesn't appear that legislative leaders want to make these recordings available. We need to ask legislative leaders to make this happen. All that is required is the desire to make the legislature more easily and readily available to Kansans. A related matter is the availability of testimony in the Kansas Legislature. In particular, the written testimony and informational presentations provided to committees would be of interest and value to citizens. Most committees, perhaps all, require conferees to supply a PDF or Microsoft Word version of their testimony in advance of the hearing. These electronic documents could be placed online before the committee hearing, and then anyone with a computer, tablet, or smartphone could have these documents available to them. And on the Kansas Legislature website, each committee has its own page. And on these committee pages, there are links for agendas, minutes, and testimony. But in most cases, there is no data behind these links. In February, I investigated and found that only about 1/3 of standing committees in the Kansas Legislature were providing any written testimony online. Since February, several committees have started using the commercial file sharing service Dropbox to make testimony and documents available to everyone. This is a reasonable way to accomplish an important goal. Publishing testimony online would be an easy matter to accomplish, and it would be a great help to those following the legislature. It would cost very little or nothing. It should be a nonpartisan issue. Another thing we need this year are reforms to the Kansas Open Records Act. An important issue is nonprofit corporations that are funded solely or primarily by government. Taxes, in other words. In Wichita, an example is the Wichita Downtown Development Corporation. It claims it is exempt from the Open Records Act because it is not a governmental agency. Despite being almost totally funded by tax revenue, still not a governmental agency, it says. And another example is Visit Wichita, our Convention and Tourism Bureau. In the past, I've asked these agencies for spending records, and they decline on the basis they're claimed that they are not public agencies. Well, in Kansas, when citizens feel they have a problem with the records law and compliance, the local district attorney is one option available to seek a remedy. And I think I've told you what happened in my case. The Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office sided with these agencies, agreeing with their contention that they are not public agencies. But the preamble to the Kansas Open Record Act reads, "It is declared to be the public policy of the state that public records shall be opened for inspection by any person unless otherwise provided by this act, and this act shall be liberally construed and applied to promote such policy." But despite this expansive language, the Sedgwick County District Attorney's Office decided that these agencies, despite being funded 90% or more by public tax funds, are nonetheless exempt from the Kansas Open Records law. Now, this year, the legislature granted the Attorney General more power to investigate violations of the Records Act. So I asked the Attorney General's office for help. And all that office did, they told me, was to consult the Sedgwick County District Attorney and rely on its ruling from several years ago. So nothing seems to have changed, and millions of dollars of taxpayer funds are still being spent in secrecy. Then there is the problem of fees. A few weeks ago, I told you how I had to pay $24 to the City of Wichita to obtain spending records that many governmental agencies make available at no charge. And I called the city's attention to the United States Freedom of Information Act, which allows for waivers in some circumstances, saying fee waivers are limited to situations in which a requester can show that the disclosure of the requested information is in the public interest, because it is likely to contribute significantly to public understanding of the operations and activities of the government. Well, that's what I was trying to do. But the city responded that the Kansas Open Records Act has no provision for the waiver of fees. And that's true. But agencies are not required by the Kansas Open Records Act to charge for records. Kansas should have a provision for fee waivers, as does the federal government. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. In the last segment, I presented some things that the Kansas Legislature should do, things which I think should be nonpartisan and have little opposition. Now, on to some issues that definitely will have some opposition. A severe problem in Kansas is our high sales tax on food. Only 14 states apply sales tax to food purchased at grocery stores for home consumption. And of those states that tax food, Kansas has either the highest rate or the second highest rate, depending on a few factors. During the debate over a proposed sales tax in Wichita in 2014, I gathered data from the United States Census Bureau regarding expenditures in various categories for 5 different levels of household income. My findings were that if the city raised sales tax by 1 cent per dollar, the lowest income class of families would experience an increase nearly 4 times the magnitude as would the highest income families when we measure this as a percentage of after-tax income. Later on, others produce similar results. This is the regressive nature of sales taxes. It affects low-income households in much greater proportion. Of note, those in Kansas do have the possibility of receiving a food sales tax credit of $125 per year. But this is something that must be applied for when filing an income tax return. Also, the credit is non-refundable, meaning that applicants must have income tax liability of at least $125 in order to receive the full credit. And low-income households generally do not have an income tax liability, which means this tax credit is not available to them. Cutting the sales tax on food by half might reduce sales tax revenue to the state by around $240 million. This is something the state really needs to do. Now, I know that when we propose tax cuts, the question usually asked is, how do we pay for the tax cut? But that's the wrong question. Tax cuts do not have a cost. It's government that has a cost. Tax cuts simply let people keep more of what is rightfully theirs in the first place. But if the legislature wanted to compensate for the lost revenue by cutting sales tax on food, here's something to consider. The Kansas Department of Transportation, KDOT, receives part of the sales tax revenue. Prior to 2013, 11.2% of sales tax revenue was transferred to KDOT. Since then, the figure has been 17.1%. If we simply change the allocation back to the pre-2013 level, that would mean an additional $180 million for the state general fund, according to estimates from Kansas Policy Institute. That goes a long way to paying for the cut in the sales tax on food. Not that I'm saying it needs to be paid for. These two things together are something the state should do to ease the burden of harshly regressive sales taxes on groceries. Another area Kansas needs to look at is school choice. Kansas is falling behind other states in the field of school choice and educational opportunity for school children, especially disadvantaged children. Now, I'm sure you've heard many Kansans brag about our state's public schools. And there is a test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, that tests a sample of students in all tests. And on this test, Kansas does well compared to other states. Well, Kansas does well when considering all students, and that is the number that the public school establishment uses to compare Kansas to other states. But when we look at subgroups by race and ethnicity, that is no longer the case. As an example, Kansas has higher NAEP scores than Texas does for fourth grade reading when we consider all students in each state. But when we look at subgroups by race and ethnicity, we find that black students in Texas outperform black students in Kansas in fourth grade reading. And the same is true for Texas Hispanic students. They score better than Kansas Hispanic students. And, astonishingly to some, the same is true for white students in Texas and Kansas. Texas white students score better than Kansas white students. So, how can Kansas as a whole do better than Texas? The reason for this? Well, it has to do with the different proportions of subgroups in the two states, which is part of a statistical phenomenon known as Simpson's paradox. But instead of acknowledging this, the Kansas public school establishment ignores it or attempts to diminish its significance. Worse than that, those who bring attention to this are called racists. It's happened to me. So in Kansas, we need to decide which is more important, the system or the school children. Those who fight against expanded school choice are casting their vote for the system as being more important than the students. This needs to change. What the state should do is to establish alternative authorizers for charter schools. Currently, local school districts must authorize a charter school that wants to open in the district, and very few local school boards will do this. So Kansas has not experienced the benefits that other states have seen with charter schools. There are other good ideas like educational savings accounts that may be introduced this session, but charter schools are a simple and proven way of increasing educational opportunity, especially for disadvantaged students. Well, here's something else. Citizens often express frustration with legislators, executives, and bureaucrats not doing their job, whatever that means. So, what recourse do citizens have when elected officials and bureaucrats are not responsive? Initiative and referendum are two answers. Citizens in Wichita have exercised these rights, but Kansans are not able to do this at the state level. Initiative is a process whereby citizens propose a new law and then gather signatures on petitions. If a successful petition is filed, the matter is generally placed on a ballot for voters to decide whether the proposed law will become actual law. Examples are the initiative to add fluoride to Wichita water, which voters rejected, and to reduce the penalties for possession of small amounts of marijuana. Voters passed that measure, but it's not taken effect pending legal action by the Kansas Supreme Court. That's initiative. Now, referendum is when citizens petition to overturn an act passed by a governing body. An example is the 2012 repeal of a charter ordinance passed by the Wichita City Council. In that case, citizens, and I was part of the effort, we gathered signatures on petitions, and then there was a campaign and an election. So at the municipal level in Kansas, citizens have the right of initiative, although in practice the right is really quite limited. The right of referendum is even more narrowly limited. But at the state level, there is no possibility for citizens to exercise initiative or referendum. The law simply does not allow for this. Well, initiative and referendum are important because they allow citizens to vote on specific laws or policies. This is different from elections for office, where voters must choose candidate A or candidate B, and voters have to take the entire package of positions associated with the candidate. It is not possible to select some positions from candidate A, mix it up with others from candidate B to get what you want. So when a candidate wins an election, can we say why? Which of the candidates' positions did voters like, and which did voters not like? The results of regular elections rarely provide clear answers to these questions. Initiative and referendum, however, let citizens vote on a specific law or proposal. There is little doubt as to the will of the voters. And when given a chance, Wichitans have often voted for policies and laws different from what the City Council wanted. An example is the 2012 overturn of a charter ordinance that the Council had passed. Another is the failure of the sales tax in November 2014. Now, that was not on the ballot because of citizen initiative, but it is nonetheless an example of voting directly for an issue rather than for a candidate. And citizens rejected the sales tax by a wide margin, contrary to the wishes of the City Council, City Hall bureaucrats, and the rest of Wichita's political class. And generally, politicians and bureaucrats do not want citizens to be empowered with initiative and referendum. When the City Council was forced to set an election due to the successful petition regarding the Ambassador Hotel issue in 2012, reactions by City Council members show just how much politicians hate initiative and referendum. As an example, in his remarks, then Mayor Cora Brewer advocated having the election as soon as possible. He told the city, by doing that, it eliminates a lot of the turmoil inside the community and unrest. So the clear message from the mayor is that the council passed the law and citizens should simply submit. How dare citizens rise up and question the wisdom of the city council and city bureaucrats? Politicians do not like citizens second-guessing their actions, but initiative and referendum give citizens this power. It will take an amendment to the Kansas Constitution for the people of Kansas to have initiative and referendum rights at the state level. And that will require passage of a resolution in both chambers of the legislature by a 2/3 margin in each, and then passage by a majority of the voters in Kansas. It seems unlikely that the Kansas Legislature would support an amendment implementing initiative and referendum. Politicians just do not want to give up the power. But initiative and referendum are popular with voters. In 2013, Gallup polled voters regarding petitioning at the national level. 68% favored this, with 23% opposed. One of the very few issues that poll higher than this is term limits for office holders. By the way, do you know what citizens and states often do after gaining the right of initiative? They impose term limits on their legislatures, and legislators don't want that. Something else. In Kansas, the way we form budgets is to start with what was spent last year and use that as the basis for the next year's spending. An alternative is zero-based or priority-based budgeting. Under these methods, agencies start with a budget of $0 and build up from there. It means that every spending program is questioned and must be justified. Now, it takes a lot of work to do this. And we're told year after year that since Kansas has a part-time citizen legislature, there is not time or expertise to implement either of these processes. But with the Senate President saying we could have a 75-day session, well, there is now some time to start doing things like this. There's even more, but I think I'll stop for now. But as you can see, there is much work for the Kansas Legislature to do. Let's ask that legislatures do this work. Let's ask that legislators do things right and do the right things instead of aiming for a short legislative session. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. An issue that's being discussed during the current Republican presidential campaign is eminent domain. The frontrunner in the race is in favor of expansive use of this process, calling it wonderful. So what is eminent domain? Is its use good or bad for property rights and freedom? And what is the current state of the law? This short video from the Cato Institute will help you make an informed decision when you select a presidential candidate, be it Republican or Democratic.
They promised an economic development project that would really revitalize the neighborhood, that would provide tremendous benefits.
What they got was exactly nothing.
10 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that governments may seize property under eminent domain solely for economic development. That decision, which cost Suzette Kelo and others their homes, is known as the Kelo decision. Put another way, more tax revenue is a sufficient reason for governments to seize private property. In the Kelo case, as in many cases of eminent domain for economic development, the projected benefits never materialized.
To this day, nothing has been built. Only feral cats have really been using the property regularly, though there is now a plan to build a memorial to the victims of eminent domain. That will be development perhaps of a sort, but certainly not the kind of bonanza that was initially expected.
The public reaction against Kelo was overwhelming.
No Supreme Court decision, certainly in recent history and perhaps in the history of the court, has sparked such a backlash that has yielded such tangible results.
Since the Kelo decision came down, 62 communities representing more than 16,000 homes and businesses successfully opposed the use of eminent domain.
Kelo was a very close 5-4 decision that caused a lot of controversy. It thereby broke down the pre-existing consensus under which most experts simply assume that everybody agrees that a public use is just whatever the government says it is.
The eminent domain power in the public use clause is a provision of the Constitution that actually is one that is fairly easy to figure out. Utilities are public uses, railroads are public uses, because everybody has the right to use the public transportation, to use the utility line. A big box retail store is not a public use.
Courts should be very comfortable looking at the facts. Does the project actually exist? Is the stated purpose the real purpose? Do they need this property? All of those things are just ordinary factual questions that courts consider all the time, but they don't want to do it in eminent domain. They should treat these cases like every other case and judge them.
45 states have passed eminent domain reform laws, and while I think many of those laws are not very effective, there are some that are really good. And finally, a number of state Supreme Courts have repudiated Kelo as a guide to the interpretation of their state constitutions. So although Kelo certainly hasn't fully resolved the problems in this area, the debate it has kicked up has made things better than they were before.
The first thing the courts need to do is say that eminent domain for economic development is unconstitutional.